Imagine walking into a bank with nothing more than a request for a car loan. You're not a billionaire. You're not a famous banker. You're not a government official. You're simply a businessman from Mali. But within a few years, hundreds of millions of dollars will allegedly move from one of the world's banks into account connected to you. And the strangest part of the story will not be the money. It will be the explanation. The story began in Dubai in 1995, when a Malian businessman named Babani Sissoko entered Dubai Islamic Bank, seeking financing for a car. What followed became one of the strangest financial scandals of the 1990s. The bank manager, Mohammed Ayub, who later claimed that Sissoko convinced him he possessed supernatural powers capable of doubling money. Then came the transfer, one after another. 183 transfers were eventually made into accounts connected to Sissoko in different countries between 1995 and 1998. The amount involved was reportedly at approximately 242 million. But this was not simply a story about a man supposedly using magic to steal money. It was a story about trust. It was a story about greed. It was a story about weak controls. It was a story about status. And perhaps most importantly, it was a story about how an ordinary man could transform himself into an international playboy surrounded by politicians, businessmen, celebrities, aircraft, and luxury cars. This is the hidden story of Foutanga Babani Sissoko. Before Dubai, before the millions, before the aircraft, before the accusations of fraud, there was a village. Foutanga Babani Sissoko was born in Mali, and very little reliable information exists about his early years. That uncertainty would eventually become part of his legend. Different accounts circulated about how he became wealthy. Some stories attributed his fortune to gold, others mentioned diamond, oil, trading, and business ventures. Sissoko himself told journalists different stories about his rise. In one later interview, he claimed that he had once been worth around 400 million. But the exact origin of his fortune remained difficult to establish. And that mystery mattered, because Sissoko understood something that many wealthy people understand very well. People do not always investigate wealth when wealth looks impressive. They admire it, they approach it, they want to be associated with it. And Sissoko began building precisely that image. He was not presenting himself as an ordinary businessman. He was becoming a personality. A man who could enter a room and make people believe that something extraordinary was about to happen. And then came Dubai. In August 1995, Sissoko walked into the headquarters of Dubai Islamic Bank. He wanted a loan to buy a car. The bank manager who handled the request was Mohammed Ayub. The loan was approved, but Sissoko did something that would change everything. He invited the banker to dinner, and during that meeting, Sissoko told Ayub that he possessed supernatural powers that would double money. At first, it sounds almost impossible. A banker, a businessman, a dinner, and a claim about magic. But the story was only beginning. According to accounts of the case, Sissoko did not simply tell Ayub that he could double money. He allegedly demonstrated it. The banker was reportedly invited to bring money. Then something extraordinary appeared to happen. The money supposedly came back doubled. To someone looking at the situation from the outside, the explanation is obvious. There had to be another explanation. A trick, a deception, a staged performance, something. But according to the later allegations, Ayub believed what he had witnessed. And this is where the story becomes less about magic and more about psychology. Because the most powerful frauds do not necessarily depend on making someone believe something is impossible. They depend on making someone want to believe it. Imagine being told that you have discovered a secret nobody else knows. Imagine believing that you can double money. Imagine believing the person standing in front of you has access to a power that ordinary people do not possess. That belief can become dangerous. And according to allegations, Sissoko's relationship with the banker escalated. Money began moving, large amounts, then larger amounts. According to reports, the transfers were made through the banking system over several years. The total eventually reached approximately $242 million. But there is something important to understand. The story should not be interpreted as literally proving that supernatural powers existed. There is no incredible evidence that Sissoko could magically duplicate money. The supernatural elements came from the allegations surrounding the case, and from what Ayub reportedly believed. Sissoko himself later rejected the accusation. When BBC journalists asked him about the $242 million, he questioned how a bank could allow such a huge amount to live through the action of one employee. His argument was essentially simple.
Vous avez reçu 242 millions de dollars de la banque?
Madame, je suis pas assez 242 millions.
If hundreds of millions disappeared, how could one person possibly have been responsible? And that question points towards the real scandal, the bank. According to Gulf News, the Dubai Islamic Bank case involved approximately $890 million in fraudulent transactions between August 1995 and January 1998. The investigation found out that most of the money disappeared through 183 telex transfers to accounts belonging to Sissoko. Some of the money also allegedly left through physical cash carried by members of the group. Think about what that means. One suspicious transaction might be missed, 10 might be overlooked, but 183 transfers across multiple accounts over multiple years, that is not simply one dramatic moment. It is a system repeatedly failing to stop something. And that is why the Sissoko case became so important. Because fraud is rarely just about the person committing it. There is usually another side. The institutions, the people who approve transactions, the people who ignore warning signs, the people who assume someone else is checking, the people who become too impressed by a customer's wealth or influence. And eventually, the money becomes too large to ignore. The banker was eventually exposed, employees were arrested, the courts became involved, but Sissoko had already begun transferring the money into something much more visible, a lifestyle. If you suddenly acquired access to hundreds of millions of dollars, what would you do? For Sissoko, one ambition was aviation. He wanted to build an airline. It was called Air Dabia, named after his home village in Mali. And this was not some imaginary business plan. Aircraft were purchased. A used Hawker Siddeley 125 was acquired. 2 Boeing 727s were also bought. The dream was enormous. An airline connecting West Africa, aircraft, hotels, casinos, business, influence. Sissoko was building an empire around himself. And this is where the story becomes visually extraordinary. Because unlike many financial crimes, this one was not hidden behind spreadsheets. The money was becoming visible. Cars, jewelry, hotels, aircraft, luxury apartments, charity, public appearances. Sissoko was creating an image of success so powerful that people began to associate him with wealth rather than suspicion. And that image will become one of his greatest assets. In America, Sissoko became known for extravagant spending. The Los Angeles Times reported that he spent millions on jewelry and cars, and even gave away cash to strangers. He also became a major donor to charitable causes. At one point, he donated $300,000 to a Miami high school marching band, and later gave $1.2 million to Camila's House, a Miami homeless shelter. To some people, he was not a criminal. He was a benefactor, a generous African businessman, a mysterious millionaire, a man who seemed to give away money almost as quickly as he made it. But there was another problem approaching: 2 helicopters. In 1996, Sissoko's business operation attempted to acquire 2 Vietnam-era Bell helicopters in Florida. The helicopters were worth approximately $270,000. The problem was that exporting them required government authorization. Instead of simply waiting for the necessary process to be completed, Sissoko's employees began trying to get the helicopters out of the country. Their behavior attracted the attention of US Customs, and then the situation became even worse. According to contemporary reporting, a custom officer was approached with an offer of money to help release the helicopters. The authorities turned the situation into a string operation. Secretly recorded conversation became evidence. and the investigators eventually connected Sissoko to the attempted payment. This was the moment when the mysterious millionaire's world began collapsing, because this time, there was no mysterious Dubai banker, no story about magic, no unexplained wealth. There was a federal investigation, and there was evidence. An arrest warrant was issued. Sissoko was arrested by Interpol in Geneva. He was eventually brought to Miami, and the man who had spent enormous amount of money trying to create an image of untouchable wealth was suddenly facing the American justice system. But even then, the story refused to become simple, because Sissoko had friends, very powerful friends. This is one of the most uncomfortable parts of the story. Sissoko had built relationships with politicians, lawyers, diplomats, and influential Americans. The Los Angeles Times reported that American political figures and members of the Congressional Black Caucus supported his character. One former senator even attempted to intervene with US authorities on his behalf. Sissoko had also been invited to political fundraising events. His wealth had created access, and access created something more powerful than money: legitimacy. Because when influential people stand beside you, ordinary observers begin to assume that you must be legitimate. That is one of the oldest tricks in the world. Not necessarily pretending to be powerful, but surrounding yourself with powerful people. Sissoko understood the psychology of status. The more important people who appeared around him, the harder it became for ordinary people to question him. And then came another controversy. A US representative wrote letters on his behalf. The Los Angeles Times reported that her daughter later received a Lexus worth tens of thousands of dollars from Sissoko's chief financial officer. That did not prove the politician had participated in wrongdoing, but it illustrated just how complicated Sissoko network had become. He was no longer simply a mysterious businessman from Mali. He had become a man operating across borders: Dubai, Mali, the Gambia, Switzerland, the United States, and everywhere he went, he carried the same weapon: money. In 1997, the American case finally reached its conclusion. Sissoko pleaded guilty to a reduced charge involving the payment of an illegal gratuity to a US customs official. He was sentenced to prison, followed by home confinement, and fined $250,000. Contemporary reports put the prison period at roughly 6 weeks, with additional house arrest. The man who had arrived in America surrounded by wealth was finally facing punishment. But there was an extraordinary detail. He did not receive a long prison sentence for the enormous Dubai banking scandal. He never spent a day in prison specifically for the alleged $242 million Dubai fraud. That distinction is crucial. The Dubai affair was a massive financial scandal, but the US conviction was connected to the helicopter bribery case. These were separate matters, and separating them is important if we want to understand what actually happened, rather than simply repeat the legend. Eventually, Sissoko returned to Africa, but his story did not end. It became mythology. In Miami, he had become almost a folk hero. Some people admired his generosity. Others saw him as a conman. Some believed the story surrounding him. Others wondered how much of his wealth was legitimate. And somewhere between those competing versions of Sissoko, the real man became almost impossible to see. Years later, journalist Bridget Shepard tracked Sissoko down in Mali. He was older, but the mystery remained. She asked him directly about the $242 million. His answer was fascinating. He did not confess. He did not provide a detailed explanation of how the money moved. Instead, he questioned the bank. How could such an enormous amount of money leave a financial institution through the action of one person? Why were there not multiple approvals? Why did the bank allow the transfer? And then he denied the central accusation. He said the only reason he had dealt with the banker was because he had gone to obtain a car loan. He rejected the claim that he had used black magic. And his response was almost sarcastic. If he really had the power to duplicate money, why would he need to work? Why not simply duplicate money everywhere? His argument raises an uncomfortable point.
We cheat the Dubai Islamic Bank out of millions of dollars. Vous avez reçu 242 millions de dollars de la banque?
Allora, je peux arrêter 240 millions. C'est une histoire qui est un peu fou. Il faudra que les messieurs Ils se mettent devant un genre, expliquer d'où passe.
Babani Sissoko's name became attached to one of Africa's most extraordinary financial scandals, a $242 million banking affair, 183 reported transfers, an alleged supernatural explanation, luxury aircraft, hotels, casinos, political connection, a helicopter bribery case, an international arrest, and a man who ultimately returned to Mali without ever facing a prison sentence specifically for the Dubai banking scandal. He died in March 2021, but his story refuses to disappear. Thanks for watching.